The world is uncertain. For 2 days, 3 days now, I guess, I've been asking all of our guests to tell me what their tip is to dealing with uncertainty. And so I'm going to give you some ideas about that now and help us unpack uncertainty a little bit more. The world is definitely uncertain, and we could just, well, let's just do this just for fun. What is uncertain today? Just in the chat, real quickly, when you think about what's uncertain to you right now, what might that be if you're willing to share that? Like, what isn't? Okay, Adrian. Uh, what's uncertain for you today? Tomorrow is uncertain. Okay. Um, there you go. There you go. Apparently, there's something on the internet about that. The future of democracy. So we have lots of things. Anything from just the uncertainty about tomorrow to like really big things. Audrey says so many things. Lifetimes, anything beyond now, which at some level is always true. Uncertain about the First Amendment. Uncertain about my federal agency. What's going to happen? Like there's lots of things, from big things to little things. The one thing I wasn't uncertain about today was what shirt I was going to wear for you all. Being a little bit seriously, how about AI? There's a big one, right? Something that we couldn't even spell 5 years ago. The economy, the climate. We go on and on and on about things that we're uncertain about. There's uncertainty. Whether I can make it to the bathroom when I have to go. And it's nice to be able to make light of this. Earlier, and I think it was when Mark and I were chatting, he said that about 15% of people think about uncertainty in a positive way, but most of us don't. I'm curious. And so here's my next question for you in the chat. What is your first thought or feeling about uncertainty? Not about what you're uncertain about, but about the idea of. What is your first thought or feeling about uncertainty? And just put that in the chat if you would. I'd love for you just not only to see what you say, but for everyone to see what others are saying. That it's constant, that it's a part of life, that it can be daunting or exciting, that my thought is that God is in control. I try to keep it in check. I see it as opportunity. I see it as normal. I could be anxious or excited, right? Things happen for a reason, my control or not of it. Anxiety, if it's a big thing, maybe less so if it's a small thing. How can I adapt? We can go on and on. So here's what the research says. The research says is that we have both thoughts and feelings. They can be both positive and negative. And you saw both. You saw all of that in the chat there, right? You saw thoughts, you saw feelings, you saw positive, and you saw obstacle. In some cases, we said both of them, right? So here's a question. Before there are rational thoughts, there is fear, Cass says. So let me just ask this question then, because Cass apparently knows what I'm going to say next, which means maybe, Cass, you should take over tomorrow. I don't know. And I'll just sit back and have a beverage. No, here's the question. Which is worse, uncertainty or fear? Just think about that for a second. Which do you think? Which is worse to you, uncertainty or fear? Anybody? Uncertainty or fear? It's split right down the middle, it appears. There's been research done on this, as it turns out. It looks like it's just about split down the middle. And here's what the research says. Some say I think it's on par. And listen, what I'm about to say about the research does not say that what your thought is necessarily wrong, but I want to give you a context for this. Because, we typically think of fear as being a pretty darn big deal, right? And maybe we don't think about uncertainty in the same way, but psychologically, according to the research, that uncertainty is actually has a bigger negative impact on us for a longer time than does fear. Because typically with fear, there comes a point when we now know that it's either real or it's either there or it's not, and yet uncertainty can go on. And I could give you examples of how I've done the research. It's somewhat irrelevant for the point that all I'm really saying is that uncertainty is a big deal. And I don't think there's any question that there's more uncertainty now than there's ever been, right? So it's worth us spending a little time thinking about it. It's one of the reasons why I've had all of our guests share their tips for dealing with it, right? So what I want to do now is share you through some of the research about how people think and how people feel about uncertainty. Um, so as it turns out, our thoughts about uncertainty range somewhere between threat and opportunity. And you saw that a number of you use that word opportunity in our little test over here, right? That our thoughts range between threat and opportunity. And some of you said it depends on how big of a thing it is, right? So how much I might see that. Our thoughts also can range between denial and acknowledgement. I either like, I'm trying to put this out of my head, or I acknowledge that here it is. And also between feeling vulnerable and feeling confident. That all of us fit somewhere on that line, and maybe move on that line between those two ideas in terms of our thoughts. And the same is true for our feelings, that there are some that we move between worry and calm, we move between fear and courage, we move between aversion and attraction. And you can see all of that in the words that you all used. None of this is meant to say, none of this is meant to say anything about how you think or feel about it in this moment, only to say that when you stop and think about it further, that you probably fit somewhere on this continuum, and that maybe you even notice times when you're on a different place on this continuum than other times, right? So this is helpful for us to have the perspective of others, to say not everyone thinks and feels about uncertainty the same way we do, and this might be somewhat affirming to you to say, okay, it's those things are all sort of there, right? There you go. So there's some things for us to consider about how uncertainty manifests for us. And I think there's really three ways that we end up dealing with it when we look at people's behaviors after thoughts and feelings. And obviously, thoughts and feelings lead to behaviors, but we end up operating with it in one of three sort of ways. Number one is we try to ignore it. Like, I'm just going to ignore the uncertainty and hope it figures it out. Que sera, sera. Perhaps I'm just going to ignore it. And the other, so what you might call the ostrich approach, right? The other is what we might call the bulldozer approach. We're just going to bulldoze our way through it. We're just going to do everything we can to plow through it, almost ignoring. Not ignoring that there is uncertainty, but it just like, we've got a process, we've used it before, we're going to keep using it, we're just going to keep going. And the third one is we're so unsure that what we say, we're going to wait and we're going to try to find the right or the best answer, and we assume that there is one. And if you think back to what David said a little bit ago, you don't have to have an answer forever, but you can have an answer for now. And so one of these three ways, we either can be the ostrich, the bulldozer, or the professor, the researcher, right? And so that's, I think, a useful way for us to think about the fact that we probably do one of these things. And I would propose to you that there are times when one of these strategies might be better than others, but the chances are you do one of them most of the time. And it's worth us considering that, right? So here's what I would say to you: that uncertainty actually requires us to be flexible. That if we're not willing to be flexible, and if we only always do one of those three approaches, that chances are we won't be as successful. So I'm going to propose to you that uncertainty requires flexibility. And I would also propose to you that if you have premium and you went back and looked at all of the answers we've gotten from our guests about how they deal with it, you're going to hear uncertainty in almost every, you're going to hear flexibility in almost every one, right? So here's a question for you now. Do you lead differently than you did 5 years ago? And just in the chat, just if you're willing to share, do you lead differently than you did 5 years ago? If you're willing to share, yes or no, you don't have to, but if you're willing to, you can do that. Mark says, heck yeah, almost definitely. Yep, 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 yes, yes, yes. Look at this. And now, guess what? I'm so glad to hear these answers. But you do realize that if I ask the general public of leaders, like you all are a special group, you know that you're special for lots of reasons, but you're special because you're here, but you're special because you chose to be here. And yes, I'm still wearing a blue shirt. That is true. Okay, here's the point that I want to make. You're all answering this way. Not everyone answers this way. But here's the thing: if you are leading differently, then you're already flexing. You're already adapting. You're already adjusting. You're already shifting. You're flexing. Okay, because here's the thing: the world of work has changed. And these are some of the things you guys said about what's currently and still uncertain. But the world of work has changed a lot in the last 5 years. I could have used 3, I could have used 8. It doesn't matter what number of years I picked. Like almost all of these things were listed in your issues or your first thoughts about uh, uncertainty, right? The way we think about work is changing. The way we do work is changing. The expectations of work is changing. Globalization is changing things. Tariffs are changing things. Geopolitical implications are changing things. Technology is changing things. Like there's just change all over. The world of work is changing. So if we're not changing, there's very little chance that the way we're leading now is better than we were then. So the fact that all of you said yes, which doesn't surprise me, is a really good sign, which tells me that you're saying, hey, I shared this with Margaret after the session was over when we were back in the green room chatting, and I shared this idea with her. I said, like, I'm not going to make the bet if you're not changing and the world is changing around you. I'm not making the bet that the world is getting closer to your way. That's not a bet worth making. Right. And so since this isn't true for you, that's great. But the reality is that if you are not changing, if you're not flexing, you're not, by definition, in a world that's changing, not getting more effective. And so we have to flex. But I want to talk about what keeps us from being flexible, because even though all of you said, yep, yes, I'm different, I lead differently than I used to, there's still a whole lot of things that keep us staying where we were. And there's still some things keeping you staying the way you were in some areas, even if you have changed some too. And I say the two big things are habit and over-believing in consistency. So let's talk about both of those for a second. Habit is a wonderful thing, but habits get in our way when we think about and say things like, this is how I lead. This is what's always worked for me. This is my approach. This is my style. This is who I am. It's not broken. Hi, Steve. You're going to get to hear from Steve tomorrow. Our habits are very powerful things. And when their habits are supporting or serving us in useful ways, then it's a tremendously valuable thing. And yet, if we're not willing to look at those habits, we got very little chance to change, because we'll just be led by those automatic responses. I actually say it this way: unexamined habits keep us from improving, because otherwise we just operate on autopilot. So all of you said, hey, I'm working to get better. I'm working to lead differently than I used to. Awesome. But there's still, and so that means you've examined some habits and said, I got to change my behavior so I can get different results. Awesome. But there are other areas where that maybe isn't happening for you. Right. And the other thing is, some people will say to me, and again, I think I'm preaching to the choir here, so I'm going to go kind of quickly here, but some people will say, but aren't I supposed to be consistent? Aren't leaders supposed to be consistent? I don't want to be a flip-flopper. I don't want people to not know where I stand, to which I say, look at the tree. Because the tree's standing firm in one spot. It is consistent and it is stable. It is not moving, and it's growing because of its stability. But that tree that right now is in a still image looks completely stable, but even a small breeze, and you would see that while that very stable tree, that very consistent tree, is also flexing. In fact, because it's flexing, it helps it to have a longer life. So this tree is stable and consistent, and this tree is also constantly flexing. And I believe in that way we should aspire as leaders to be like a tree. that we should try to be like the tree. That because the question isn't should we be consistent or flexible. The question is how can we be consistent and flexible? And when we tie that back to the metaphor of the tree, here's the point: that we should be consistent in our values, in our what, in our why, in our purpose, but we should be flexible in our approach, flexible in our how. Our how has to be able to shift and change and adjust. And that goes back to the question that I asked you earlier. So if we want to be, if flexibility is the key to dealing with uncertainty, or is a key to dealing with uncertainty, then we have to understand what keeps us from being flexible. And it is our habits and our thoughts about consistency, because the world is not an either or place. It's very much a both and place. Remember those things I showed you earlier about what we think and feel about uncertainty, and you saw them laid out on a continuum, and that there's a tension between those things because they're kind of like opposites. They're the same kinds of ideas that Margaret and I were talking about her zigzag approach. We're putting two things opposing each other, and yet neither are 100% correct, and neither are 100% wrong. And sometimes we need to be moving in one direction or the other. It's a really powerful thing to think about, that the world is a place of much more shades of gray than black and white. I am not saying there aren't absolute truths. I believe that there absolutely are. But in our world, there's far more that's gray than black and white, because we live in a world that is complex and in a world that's changing. And it's really critically important. And we've grown up learning that there's a right answer. And we've grown up learning that it's either this or it's that. And it's a seductive idea, and it's a simplistic idea, and yet it's not the world in which we live in for the most part. And so I would suggest to you this. Here's something that I've written that I think is useful. It's a way to think about what you could call both and leadership. The test of an effective leader is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind and apply each when needed. Holding those two ideas in mind and being able to apply both of them, that's both and leadership. That's flexible leadership. That's what it is. It's flexible leadership. And yeah, you've seen me flash up the book, Flexible Leadership. And I believe and if you look at the subtitle of that book, it says, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. And when we understand this ability of these tensions and to say, hey, we can move through this, then we can build some confidence, not in our next move as much as that we know we can keep moving. And that's a key component here. I want you to, some of you may have seen this analogy from me before. I don't think all of you have, though. So I want to share this with you real quickly. I want you to imagine that I put you in this place. Here you are. You're in the wilderness. You're in the jungle. You don't know the way out. And no, I'm not actually putting you on Survivor, but it's that idea, like, here I am. This is all I can see. And I say to you, your job is to, Stacy wants to be in this place. I was trying to make this a scary-ish picture that you, with a lot of uncertainty, that you'd like to figure out how to get out of, right? So like, let me ask you this. If you're in this spot in the wilderness and I say your job, there is a road, and your job is to get to that road so you can get out of this situation, what do you want? Just tell me in the chat. If that's the situation you're in, what do you want? Well, if I can only give you one thing, what would be the one thing you'd want in that situation? You want to get out. And I've told you there's a way out. Okay, a direction. I want to listen to sound. Okay. What else? A GPS. GPS. I'm not giving you your phone, so no GPS. But here's the thing. Ultimately, even the person saying the GPS is saying, what I want's a map. And if I'm climbing shoes to climb a tree, so I want to get up in the tree so I can see further. I need a map so I can see here. You're in the mall, right? You're at Disney World. You are here. I need to know where I am so I can know which direction to go. Now, some of you have watched too much of these shows, right? I want survival gear. I want a tarp. Like I don't know. But I follow along with the idea here that what we need is a map so we can know based on if I know where I'm at, then I can know where to go. A map gives me context of the situation, and I would say to you, as leaders, we need a map in a world that isn't all the same as it used to be. And I'm not going to dive into this deeply, but I want to give you the context of the map that we suggest we think about, and it's called the Cynefin framework. Doesn't look like it should say Cynefin. Just remember that it rhymes with Kevin. It's the Cynefin framework, and it basically says, here's the map of any situation that we're in. That the situation we're in is either clear, complicated, complex, or chaotic. And you may have heard me use those three of those words yesterday when we were having a conversation with someone. Excuse me. But if the situation is clear and we've been in this context before and we know exactly what works, then we operate in one certain way. And if it's a complicated situation where maybe there are people that have all the answers, but we don't have all the answers, then we know that there are things that could be learned that we don't know. Then that gives us another set of actions we might take. But a lot of times the situation we're actually in is complex, which means that there are unknowable things that are unknown, and we can't come up with all the answers, and we won't find them all, and it truly is uncertain. And when that's the case, then we need to operate in a different way than if it's a clear situation or a complicated situation. And then there's the context of it's truly in chaos. And no, I am not left-handed. I'm not sure why you're asking, but no, I'm not left-handed. I have a left hand, on the other hand. But a chaotic situation is one where in the moment, it's truly chaos. And we just need someone to say, let's go this way and see. Fewer situations are chaotic than we like to think. And when we're in chaotic situations, we tend to be looking for someone to take the lead and take direction and say, let's go this way. And that's a really good thing. Yeah, I read the chart the way I did because I wanted to start with what we are used to and what we're comfortable with. Yeah. And I ended with chaotic because most of us tend to think of the world as either being clear or chaotic. And I would suggest to you that much more of our world is actually complicated and complex, and more so than ever. And I don't have time to dive into this more other than to say that having a map to help us understand the context of the situation we're in is critical to us being more successful, especially in times of uncertainty. And I would say to you, and I said it earlier, that context makes us a lot smarter. And I'll just prove this to you right now. Because there's been a time in your life when someone has asked you for guidance or for an answer or for a decision, and you said, well, it depends. And what it depends on is context. If you were going truly simply on your habit, you just say, oh, this looks like something I've seen before, go do it this way. But when you stop long enough to say it depends, you're fundamentally knowing that we need to think about the context of this situation, because once I know the context, it will change what my answer or what our next steps might be. And when we have that context, it makes us a lot smarter. I can tell you lots of times people will ask me questions in an email, like people like you will ask me a question in email, they'll ask me a question in LinkedIn, and I'm happy to get those questions. And my first comment always is, well, I wonder what, it depends on a bunch of stuff. And usually I don't answer before I ask some more questions to help me understand. Because once I understand context better, I can do a better job of giving you at least an insight or something to consider. So the idea of flexible leadership is three things, and I've really given you all three now. I've said we have to be intentional enough to say that, hey, flexible, it's worth us being flexible. We have to be able and willing to override our habit, natural tendencies, or auto responses. And then we have to consider what the context is. And then we have to think about flexing. And while you don't know it, I've already given you a bunch of flexors. And some of you have said this morning that you've read Flexible Leadership. So you were familiar with the way I showed you those pictures earlier. Because the idea of a flexor is that there's two ends And some of us might be detail oriented, and some of us are big picture thinkers, and we have an approach that is our natural tendency somewhere on this scale, somewhere on this flexor, as we would call it. And you can all think of people that lean too far either direction. If we're too detail oriented, that's going to cause us problems. And if we're too big picture thinking, sometimes that's going to cause us problems. And I can tell you that you lean one direction on this or the other. And I can tell you that not every situation you're leaning is going to serve you best. So the idea of a flexor is to say, I'm willing to look at other alternatives. What does the context tell me? How do I need to flex? So there's lots of flexors, and we don't have time to unpack all those. What I want to unpack for you is the idea, and I've said it over and over now, is that flexible leadership is about being willing and able to flex. And to do that is both and requires us to use what I call flexor thinking. And this is flexor thinking. And both and is flexor thinking. This is just one example. This, by the way, happens to be one of the examples from Margaret's zigzag exercise as well, as it turns out. Okay. So here's the thing. Some of you have heard me talk about these three things: mindset, skill set, habit set. And as it relates to this and most everything else, absolutely, the zooming in and out concept can absolutely apply here. In fact, zooming out can help us understand and see the map more clearly. Because if we don't zoom out or distance ourselves in some way, we will stay in our habit. We'll stay in our habit. It's exactly right, Kenneth. So mindset means we recognize that we need a new approach to an uncertain and complex world. Skill set says now we have an approach. Habit set says we practice the approach. Now, I really haven't given you all the skill set. I really haven't given you the habit set, but hopefully I've helped you see the mindset and realize that there is an approach and that it can help us be more successful. What could you do next? And here's what that looks like. You may have gotten the idea that the ideas that I've been sharing are things in this book, Flexible Leadership, and they definitely are, right? So in this book, we talk about the ideas I just shared and a whole lot more, including a lot more about those flexors, a lot more about answering those questions, and how do we flex, and various ones of those flexors based on the situation, to Stacy's question. And what I want to tell you is that if you go to that link, if you don't have books, if you don't have this book, there are ways to get this book and more books. And the more books you get, the more of these things below here you get. And I don't want to go into this a long way, except to say this, that there's some very quick and easy ways for you when you invest in books to get more stuff. And some of you might know that in March, we did a one-day version of VLC that was all around the ideas in flexible leadership. And so if you go buy 2 copies of the book, we're going to give you the equivalent of premium for that day. So you buy 2 books and you'll spend less than you spent just for premium for this event, just for that. And if depending on how many books you got, we have all these other approaches that we have taken to help you turn these skills into habits in your organization. We've got workshops, webinars, we can do keynotes, all those sorts of things. A lot of those things are discussed when you go to that page. And there's ways that you can invest and get books for your organization to help you. And if you say, well, Kevin, I'm just me, and what I really want is to get this book for myself, and I don't have a copy yet, to which I say, I love that. And I would suggest that you buy 2 and give one to a friend, or buy 2 and both of you pay for one, or whatever. But here's the point, because when you do that, you're going to get the VLC from March for both of you. But the other thing is, you've now got someone else that's reading this with you, and you can walk through the learning and understanding the skills together. But more importantly, you improve the odds that you will apply those things, that you'll move from skill set to habit set. Because if 2 of you have gone through it together, and you can reinforce, you can encourage, you can hold each other accountable, help each other apply those things, etc. So we really hope that if you don't have a copy of this book, that you will do that. And we really hope that you see how this book, I believe, is the book for our time, given that there is so much uncertainty and that we have so much that we need to work on and think about in relationship to that.